quite a few people on the line, so I think we'll get started. I just want to let everybody know, well, first of all, welcome everybody to our drop-in meeting, and especially Durhane. We are recording this meeting, and we'll make the podcast available on our website, so if you want to ask some questions of Durhane, I mean, normally the meetings that we have, people sometimes ask some personal questions, and as personal with respect to their health situation. So if you want to just use a first name or a pseudonym, that's fine, because there will be probably hundreds of other people listening to this recording at some point in the future. So just do that. So I could spend probably the next hour introducing Durhane, so I'm going to try to keep it short. Durhane is, in my mind at least, first and foremost the president of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. She's also the president and CEO of the Institute for Optimizing Health Outcomes, and head of the Consumer Advocare Network. She's also the chair-elect of the board of the International Alliance of Patient Organizations. Durhane, many of you may know her from a past life when she was president of the Canadian Hemophilia Association during the tainted blood scandal, I dare call it. She served on a number of health policy advisory committees and panels, and I think I'll leave it at that. Durhane's going to talk to us a little bit about a lot of progress that the Canadian Organization of Rare Disorders has made at the federal level in getting Canada to jump on board with most other OECD countries and have some sort of legislative or regulatory framework in place to deal with drugs for rare disorders. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Durhane.
Thanks a lot, Jim, and thank you guys so very much for not only inviting me, but for coming on to the call. If anytime you can't hear me clearly or fade out, just sort of give a holler, and I'll try to remember to project back into the phone. Sometimes I get, my voice drops off here. Well, you are the first group that I've actually gotten a chance to actually provide an update on, so it's very timely. And in fact, I just came back from Ottawa today from our second round of meetings on the overall changes to the regulatory framework. So let me just sort of put it in context. I mean, right now, Health Canada is looking at changing and updating the entire regulatory framework. That is the set of regulations that are used to to review drugs for making them available in Canada. And basically, I think that most people would know that Health Canada, you have to get approval from Health Canada in order to sell a drug in Canada. They review it primarily for whether or not for the balance of what they call risks and benefits. That is, to what degree do the benefits outweigh the risks, recognizing that no drug is actually ever risk-free. So the question really is, are there significant benefits to it that one would then make it available? And then it goes on from Health Canada to be reviewed in terms of whether or not it's going to be funded by the provinces. So right now we're just talking about making these drugs available in Canada so that they can at least be possibly to be sold and possibly reimbursed. Being approved by Health Canada doesn't guarantee that they'll be reimbursed, but if they're not approved by Health Canada, it's guaranteed that they will not be reimbursed. I think, as most people would know, we still are one of the few developed countries that does not have what we would call a framework for orphan drugs or drugs for rare diseases. The U.S. has had one for more than 25 years, and the European Union has had one for more than 10 years. And it's through those bodies that, in fact, we've had the huge amount of development and research to make drugs for rare diseases. Prior to that time, I think most people, we always say in the decade prior to 1984, there were only 10 new drugs for rare diseases. So in that entire period of time, there were only 10 drugs. And primarily because most companies would consider it too expensive to produce a drug for a very small patient population. In 1984, the U.S. passed the Orphan Drug Act, and since that time, there have now been I think more than, now I've forgotten the exact number off the top of my head. Certainly, more than about 700 drugs that have been made available through that time, and certainly more than 2,000 that are in development right now. And similarly, in the UK, in the 10 years since they have been in place, there's been about 75 new drugs that have been approved for rare diseases. So there has been, through this Orphan Drug Act, significant progress made in terms of getting drugs for most of our diseases that previously had no treatment. Basically, what the Orphan Drug Regulations or the Orphan Drug Act or legislation, however they're put forth, allow for are several kinds of incentives. Some people, the most important incentive, quite frankly, is in fact giving companies market exclusivity for a period of time, meaning that nobody else can make a drug make that same drug for exactly that same condition. It means then that companies have a longer period of time in which they can actually recoup the cost of the drugs, plus some additional benefits, which I'll talk about, because this is the kind of regulation that Health Canada is now looking at. Suffice it to say that because of the special emphasis, we have seen drugs for rare diseases. Now, the problem in Canada is because we have not had any kind of orphan drug legislation. For companies then are very slow, one, to develop new drugs in Canada, and secondly, even when the drugs have been developed elsewhere, they're very slow to bring them to Canada. By our estimation, less than a quarter of the drugs that have been approved in the U.S. for rare diseases actually make it to Canada. And similarly, only about a third of the drugs that have been approved in the European Union actually make it to Canada, because there are no provisions that allow the drugs to be, I think, approved especially in a way that's different than other drugs. So, and I'll talk a bit about that. So I think, as Jim says, as an organization, we have been trying to get Health Canada to bring in some special provisions that would recognize drugs for rare diseases. Health Canada in 1998 put out a notice that said we really don't think it's necessary because drugs are already being developed, and quite frankly, most of the drugs that are needed for rare diseases we can approve in Canada without special provisions. I mean, which is absolutely not true, and that's it for all the things that I said before. In many cases, companies don't even bother coming to Canada. So what is it that we're talking about here? First of all, what we're talking about is trying to get the government to have a definition for rare diseases. I think we're also used to the idea of rare diseases. It may come as a surprise to people to know that in Canada there is no definition for rare diseases. A rare disease doesn't actually exist in Canada. In the rest of the world, a rare disease usually means a disease that affects fewer than 1 in 2,000 persons. And that would include diseases that most of you know. I mean, obviously includes diseases like alpha-1, would include diseases like lupus, or include diseases like cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, and then some that are extremely, extremely rare that you may see in the news, and one that was very recently in the news in terms of a young man trying to get access to treatment. So the definition is fewer than 1 in 2,000. It's actually a little bit more liberal in the U.S., but most countries will go for less than 1 in 2,000. It means that if you can demonstrate that you're trying to create a treatment for a disease that is for fewer than 1 in 2,000, you may then get access to some special provisions. And what we've been talking about at Health Canada now, and for the first time this past year, Health Canada has begun to draft regulations that would actually allow for a special recognition. So let me just sort of tell you what they are proposing. And what I will say as a preamble to that is that what they're proposing pretty much mirrors what the European Union is doing. And we like that for several reasons. First of all, we like it because it will allow a drug company that is developing a drug to apply for designation as an orphan drug in Europe and in Canada at the same time. So they don't have to make a special request in Canada, which actually requires a great deal of work on their part. Secondly, because what is being proposed in Canada is very similar to the European Union, it also means that the development can actually take place under pretty much the same circumstances, and they could likely apply for approval at about the same time. It also means that some companies who actually do develop and research and develop drugs in Canada could in fact be motivated to stay in Canada. If the company's in Canada, it also will give us greater likelihood that we can have patients that will be enrolled in the clinical trials, meaning then two things. One is our physicians have experience with these drugs, and secondly, there's a greater likelihood that if patients have already experienced these drugs, that we will be able to make pressure for Health Canada to approve the drugs. So all of those things are important. So what is it that they're proposing? They're proposing, first of all, that the definition would be, they say officially 5 in 10,000, which is the same as 1 in 2,000. And there's lots of reasons why they use that number, because some other countries have other numbers out of 10,000, but just to recognize it means the same thing. It means that Canada recognizes that because these patient populations are very small, then other kinds of requirements are needed in order to develop these drugs and bring them to market. The first thing it recognizes, I think as many people would know, is that in order to develop a drug for approval, you have to be able to do clinical trials. In many respects, the requirements for a clinical trial are too difficult for a rare disease to meet. Because I think as most people will know, a clinical trial means after you've gone through sort of early stages of development, you really have to be able to prove that the drug works and that it's safe. And in order to do that, I think as most of you would know, you do what they call a randomized control trial. You give part of the group, you give half of the group, let's just say half, the treatment, and you give the other half a placebo. And then you study them to see if, in fact, the group that gets the treatment actually does do better in the way that you predict than the group that does not. And you also have to check to see that the group that's on the treatment does not suffer severe side effects in a way that would make it that the drug is dangerous. In order for this to work, you usually have to have a fairly large number of patients, and you have to follow the patients for a long period of time. Traditionally, you would need to have several hundred patients in the trial, and you would often follow them for 6 months, a year, sometimes up to 2 years. With rare diseases, you don't have hundreds of patients, obviously. And secondly, in many cases, because these are severe life-threatening diseases, you want to get the drug to patients a lot quicker than waiting a couple of years for the trials to be done. So what orphan drug regulations or legislation recognizes is that, in fact, you have to be able to do these trials with smaller numbers of patients. It means in many cases it's more difficult to prove it. The other thing that these regulations recognize is that in many cases we don't know as much about rare diseases as we do about more common diseases. We don't know sometimes the exact cause of the disease. We don't know exactly the progression of the disease. That is, what's the natural history of the disease? Take alpha-1, for example. Lots of people may experience different symptoms. They may experience them at different stages. They may, in fact, sometimes spontaneously have much more severe episodes than others. We really don't understand very well what it is that is going on in these diseases. We don't have a very good database that would help us explain how these diseases actually progress. Not in the same way as we would understand hypertension, diabetes, even cancers. We don't understand them. Because we don't understand oftentimes the way in which the diseases progress naturally, it is oftentimes more difficult, right, to demonstrate that, in fact, the drugs are working. So what happens is that when you have a drug for a rare disease, hello? Hello? Oh, sorry, I keep hearing a beep. I was afraid I was cutting myself off here. It is kind of beeping at me. I hope that isn't my phone dying. Hold on, let me go see if I can get another phone.
We're not hearing anything.
I know. I'm afraid my phone is dying. Let me just grab another phone for a second, just in case.
While Durhane does that...
Hello? Okay, let me just use this other phone here. Hopefully this works better. Okay, so can you hear me okay still?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so, and I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, whether this is too much detail. Maybe this is a good time to stop for half a second. Is this too much detail to go into?
I'm understanding it.
It depends what letter you want us to write to the federal minister.
Okay, well, let me just sort of continue a little bit more in terms of the background, because I do think we want to, I think I think it's helpful to understand kind of what we're trying to do here. What we are trying to do is to make sure that drugs for rare diseases it's not just the fact that we need to have Health Canada say, okay, we will do something to stimulate the research and development. Part of the bigger challenge is really how do we get them approved. And right now, companies choose not to come to Canada because we don't have any specific standards that say, okay, for a drug for a rare disease, we can look at the evidence in a different way than we would at a drug that's for a big population. And for a drug for a rare disease, we will look at the evidence in a different way than we would a drug for disease that we know a whole lot about. We have to make some real special provisions. And part of what happens in the U.S. and part of what happens in Europe is they sit down with the drug company ahead of time, and they say to the drug company, look, let us help you design the drugs so that we can agree. What do you have to do to demonstrate that it's working? So we'll go back to Alpha 1. What is it that you would need to show that will let us know that this drug is working? Because remembering again, we're only going to have the patients in the clinical trial for a short period of time. Obviously, we're not going to show that the disease is cured. We're not necessarily going to be able to demonstrate in terms of clinical outcomes. That is that, that your lung capacity gets better, that you don't have as many episodes, because, again, it's a short period of time. So we need to have some agreement. What are the indicators that says, yes, this drug is working, and if we were to continue it over the period of time, people would have fewer clinical effects? That's the big question. It's sort of like if you think about it in terms of cancer. We're not going to cure the cancer, but we need to have some agreement. How much slower does the cancer have to be growing for us to agree that the drug is working? It's taken a long time for cancer to come to that agreement. For the rare diseases, as you can imagine, given how many there are and how little we know about them, this takes a lot of discussion around what is a good clinical outcome. What's happened in the past is that a drug company will go ahead, they will do a trial, they will say these are good outcomes, and they're not necessarily clinical. They're sometimes what we call surrogate outcomes. They're outcomes that stand in place of. And then you get to the regulator, you get to Health Canada, and they say, oh, no, we don't like those outcomes. Those aren't strong enough outcomes. Those are too short-term outcomes. Those are outcomes that do not necessarily give us confidence that even though you achieve those outcomes, that the disease is actually going to be slowed down or better or whatever. So we need to have that kind of debate and dialogue ahead of time. If we've agreed ahead of time, then there's a great deal better likelihood that if I can make that happen, you're going to approve my drug. So all of those things are part of the orphan drug regulation. So all of those are the things that we're building into the regulations. The other thing that other countries have for orphan drugs, if you recognize, it costs about $250,000 to file for a license. And so this is a huge amount of money. And if you're thinking about a small patient population, a lot of companies, again, don't want to do it, because they don't know if the drug's going to get approved, and beyond it, they don't know if it's going to actually be reimbursed. In other countries where there is orphan drug regulations, they waive the fee. There's no fee if you're doing it for a drug that's already been designated as an orphan drug. We don't charge you anything. So again, that's being proposed. So again, there's an incentive. Then that's why we say sometimes companies ask the question, should I bother coming to Canada? Because it's going to cost me actually to make the application. The other thing that this orphan drug regulations hopefully would do, as I say, is that it would give companies the incentive to file in Canada at the same time as they file in other countries. Right now, what happens is that companies often wait 2, 3, sometimes 5 years to file in Canada. By the time they get ready to file in Canada, they have to make a whole new submission. They have to put all the evidence together because it's based on the time at the filing. It has to be timely. It means that this is a lot of additional work for a company. So even if it's 6 months later that they're filing, it's a lot of work. So they choose sometimes not to do it. Again, what we want to do is make it as easy as possible for them to say, here's my file. I'm going to send it to the U.S., I'm going to send it to Europe, I'm going to send it to Canada all at the same time. And what's happened in Europe and in the U.S. is they have now made an agreement. They have agreed that they will ask for one filing. Whatever you're going to file in the U.S., you can file in the EU. So this is great for companies, and so they basically say, fine, we can do one filing. What we want to do is for them to be able to say, well, fine, let's file in the U.S., file in Canada, and file in the EU at the same time. So all of this is kind of what's being proposed in the regulations. It's a huge, the other thing that's being proposed, and it's part of our overall framework, which is really, really important, and that is that we can accept the drug and approve a drug on what we call phase 2 data. We can accept a drug that is not as, that hasn't necessarily gone through as a robust a clinical trial as we might ordinarily expect. If a drug is deemed as a drug for a patient population in which first of all, it's a serious disease, and secondly, if there are no other treatments for the disease, or the treatment that's being proposed is considered to be significantly better than what's on the market, then what you can do is you can try to get approval for the drug on what we call sort of early status. It means that the Health Canada or the regulator could say, look, we're not entirely convinced in terms of the long-term efficacy. We do believe that the drug is safe. You have to show that. We're not entirely sure whether all the benefits that we're seeing short-term are going to hold up long-term or whether they're going to translate into significant clinical changes. But the evidence is good enough and the need is great enough that we will give you approval to market, and we're going to ask you to continue to collect that data over a longer period of time. That's what we're asking. So this is very, very, very important, and again, it's a significant difference from what has happened in the past. And again, this is what many other countries do, and that's why it allows. That's why companies then are so eager to go into certain jurisdictions. They can do it with information that is not necessarily as long a clinical trial, it's not as strong a data, but it's good enough to indicate that, yes, we expect that this drug will hold up. This, again, is part of what is being proposed, that we can approve the drug, put some conditions on it that would allow you to do ongoing clinical trials while the drug is being made available to a larger number of people. We believe it's safe enough, but we're going to make it available. What we want to do is have you continue to collect data and demonstrate in the EU and in the U.S. the requirement is that you come back in 5 years and refile. We haven't had those kinds of agreements in Canada, but this is, again, what's being proposed. We can do it even on, as we say, phase 2 data, which is not necessarily even randomized controlled trials. We will give you the approval. You can market it. You can make it available. We need you to continue to collect the information, and then over a period of time, we will see if the benefits that you're claiming actually hold up. If they do, we leave the drug on the market. If not, we might ask you to come back and do some other things. All of this is, sort of hugely important in terms of giving people earlier access to drugs. So, as I said, we're right now in the process then of making, or the government's in the process of making these kind of regulatory changes. The big thing that we want from the rare disease community is that we would like for them to address the orphan drug regulations before they addressed all the other regulations. This is a big package of regulations. I mean, we had 2 days of meetings before. We just had 3 days of meetings now. We got another 3 days in January. But even after that, it could be months and maybe, years, or hopefully not years, before they would actually approve the entire regulatory framework. What we have gotten agreement, at least verbally, from David Lee, who's the key drafter of this, that he is willing to focus on the orphan drug regulations separate from the whole regulatory bundle and to try to move these through separately. That could allow us to have a set of regulations that could begin to be in place as early as, next year. So one of the things we want to ask for is, in fact, for the government to recognize that this is a priority issue and that they should expedite the regulatory reforms for rare diseases.
I think it's kind of a challenge, if I might say this, that Health Canada has one concept and the government of Ontario has taken liberty to address this small population and say no to any potential help before Health Canada makes its regulation change.
Well, really, we're talking about two very, very different things, okay? I mean, that's the challenge, okay?
I see.
All we're talking about right now in terms of Health Canada is the approval for a drug to be marketed. After that happens, it still is up to the provinces to decide whether or not they're going to pay for it. That's a totally different question.
I see.
It's a big challenge. And right now, without an orphan drug legislation, regulations, or anything else, right, drugs are still being made available for rare diseases. Drugs are still being approved or not approved for rare diseases. All this will do at the moment is change the ability for Health Canada to give drugs not only quicker approval, but give approval to drugs that they might have in the past not approved. But the big hurdle still, as you say, are what are we going to do in terms of getting them funded? It's a different question. And we can talk about it, but recognize the totally different questions, a totally different body that would make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that I haven't talked about is that even if we get the regulatory framework, some of the changes that are being recommended actually don't go into effect until we have new legislation. So regulations are things that are written by the bureaucrats to think about regulations. There are the rules for how something is done. The legislation gives the legal right to do it. So in some respects, some of the regulatory changes that are being talked about can be done under the current laws, but some of them will require some changes in the law in order to make that happen. What happened was that, a year and a half ago, Health Canada tried to introduce new legislation, some real major changes in the Canada Health Act that would allow for some of this to happen. That actually, for lots of other reasons, got delayed, and they withdrew the legislation, and then the House rose, et cetera, et cetera. So we still need to have changes in the law in order for some of this to happen. But right now we're just focusing on getting the rules changed in order for companies to be able to do this. In order for some of the legal elements to be in place, the law would also have to change, and that's a different kind of advocacy that we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll leave it at that for a moment. I don't know if there are any questions in terms of what we're doing. The other thing that is happening, because we've been doing a lot of lobbying, and this is a bigger picture, is not only do we want to have an Orphan Drug Act like they do in the U.S. and in Europe, what's happening in Europe is that the European Union has asked all of the countries to come up with a plan for rare diseases. And we are also lobbying the government, not only to give us this rare, this provision. The plan for rare diseases is really a much bigger picture, and that would include some of the things that we know is necessary. For instance, it would put in provisions for national screening. It would put in provisions for national centers of excellence or national centers of reference, where in fact you could have experts who would become centers that would provide expertise and support to other clinics, for instance, in terms of understanding, diagnosis, and treating rare diseases. It would put in place communications or plans for research. It would put in place the ability to provide things that we're doing right now at a provincial level, like the newborn screenings, etc. So what we're asking for is actually a bigger package, which would include what is happening right now in Europe in terms of having programs or plans that would support the diagnosis, treatment, and support for rare diseases, including within those plans or support for patient organizations to actually provide information and education to patients and families. I mean, part of what we're asking when we ask people to go in and talk to the government or talk to their MPs or to write to the government is to not only reference the orphan drug regulations, but also to call for a national plan on rare diseases. And we've got a member of Parliament who's the co-chair of the Health Committee, as well as a member of the Senate who are willing to put forth a private member's bill to call for a national plan for rare diseases.
Did Alpha-1 meet the criteria to be considered a rare disease?
Absolutely. Alpha-1 is, in any jurisdiction, Alpha-1 is considered to be a rare disease.
It's Ontario.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's Ontario.
Yeah, it's inheritance.
Well, don't get too excited. Even if it were designated as a rare disease in Ontario, it doesn't necessarily mean the treatments would be funded. Yeah. I mean, all of those are totally, unfortunately, each one of those are different issues.
Yeah, it's just emotionally, as a patient, it's very difficult to see that in Ontario, some patients aren't getting the care. That's the emotion of the...
Yeah, but let me sort of reassure you that even if tomorrow Ontario woke up and said we're going to call Alpha-1 a rare disease, it wouldn't change what the access to treatment is.
I see.
I mean, think about the young boy who's trying to get access to treatment for TNH.
Yeah.
TNH is definitely a rare disease. It's, nobody would deny that. It doesn't mean he's getting treatment yet. I mean, these are the challenges. We have to wrestle it all down. In some respects, I don't want to get fooled by, having, say, orphan drug regulations. I wouldn't want to get fooled by even having a national plan to say that the situation's been fixed.
Right, because it really is all about money.
It really is all about getting access, exactly.
Yes, Jim here, and really what, from the point of view of Alpha-1, what these federal regulations, legislation changes will help is if someone were to come up with another treatment or treatment for the liver manifestation of Alpha-1, what it's going to affect is treatments that haven't been invented yet.
Well, you do know that there are several treatments for Alpha-1 that are, in fact, in development and have been designated as orphan treatments in the EU. They haven't gone through the approval phase, but they're in development, right? There are several treatments that are already...
They're not introduced into Canada yet.
Well, they haven't been introduced anywhere yet. They haven't gone through all the full trials.
I see.
So there's two stages, right? At the first stage, a company says, I want to make a drug for rare disease. I've got an idea for a drug for Alpha-1. So I'm going to go into the European Union, I'm going to go into the U.S. FDA, and I want to file my application. I haven't completely, done any trials yet for the drug. But I think it's a good idea, and here's how I think it might work, et cetera, et cetera. And then the government would say, wow, that looks promising. Yes, that's a rare disease. We're going to designate your drug as an orphan drug. That gives you now all these benefits. It'll give you help in terms of designing your clinical trials in the U.S. It gives you tax incentives. It gives you support for, hosting these clinical trials. It gives you a whole host of benefits. And when you bring the drug to market to get it approved, we've already agreed on what some of those outcomes ought to look like. Now I still have to apply to it, and I still have to prove that the drug works, right? But so that's the second stage. So there are several drugs now that have already been designated as orphan drugs for alpha-1. None of them have actually gone to the point where they say, okay, we finished our clinical trials, can you give us approval to market? But some of them are very close. And as Jim says, if we had orphan legislation here, it would give the companies a greater incentive to say, okay, let's go and get approval from Health Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So, Durhane, this can be. Mm-hmm. In my next letter I write to our federal minister, then I want to emphasize, if I have understood what you said, I want to emphasize that we want them to accept phase 2 data, and that we want to have the regulations for orphan drugs to take precedent over the overall regulations so they get a more speedy approval. Is that correct?
I don't know if you want to say you want them to accept phase 2 data. That's probably too specific because they will only accept that under certain circumstances. But what you want them to do is to, in fact, have orphan drug regulations that are similar to the EU and to the FDA. Okay. And that would include then all the things that you're talking about.
Okay.
I mean, so let's not be too specific, but, I mean, you could just reference the fact that orphan drug regulations are being proposed right now, being worked on within Health Canada, and that you want them to expedite, the development and approval of those.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it is huge news in the sense that, after 25 years, or at least after 15 years of fairly intensive discussions with Health Canada, they have finally agreed that, yes, rare diseases are different than other diseases. And yes, they require some special kinds of provisions in order for us to get drugs here. It is a big message. I mean, if they were to approve the definition, to your point, it will put a lot of pressures on the provinces to actually go along with it. Right now, we have a difficult time challenging provinces, in terms of what their choice of a definition is, because there is no national agreement as to what a definition is.
Just seems a shame that they're only looking at this in the sense of dollars.
Well, I mean,
UK and U.S.
Yeah, I know.
It's supported.
But be clear that even in Europe, even in the U.S., just because a drug doesn't get approved doesn't mean that it's available to all patients. It doesn't mean it's funded. It's only the first step. So that is unfortunate.
It is.
Let me sort of talk about the next step. We are talking to all the provinces about the need for some other kinds of programs. As you know, Ontario does have a Drugs for Rare Diseases program, which is terribly impoverished in terms of what it actually does do.